Lady Eleanor Ashworth stepped down from the carriage and looked up at Blackthorn Manor for the first time. The house was grand, with tall grey stones and dozens of windows that caught the fading afternoon light. She should have felt proud. Instead, she felt like a stranger arriving at someone else's home, because in every way that mattered, she was. She had married Sebastian Wren, the Duke of Ravensworth, 3 weeks earlier. It was not a match born of love. Her family needed the connection, and his estate needed an heir. Sebastian's first wife, Margaret, had died 2 years before, along with the son she had been carrying. Since that day, the Duke had shut himself away from the world, and everyone in the county knew it. Eleanor had been warned, gently, by her own mother, that the Duke was a cold man now, and that she should not expect warmth from him. She had nodded and said she understood. She had not truly understood, not until she lived it. From the very first evening, Sebastian made his position clear, without ever raising his voice. He greeted her with polite words and empty eyes. He ate his meals alone in his study, sending word through the housekeeper that he was occupied with estate matters. He did not ask about her day, her comfort, or her thoughts. He simply existed beside her, like a shadow that shared her house, but not her life. The heart of the manor was the great hall, and the heart of the great hall was a portrait. It hung above the fireplace, larger than any other painting in the house, and it showed Margaret in a blue silk gown, smiling softly, her hand resting on the back of a chair. Sebastian passed beneath it every day. Sometimes Eleanor saw him stop and look up at it for a long moment before continuing on his way, as though he were greeting someone who could still hear him. Eleanor understood grief. She did not resent him for missing his first wife. What wounded her was the silence that grew between them, day after day, with no sign of ever breaking. She refused to let herself become bitter. She had been raised to find purpose in difficult places, and so she looked for purpose at Blackthorn Manor. She learned the names of every servant within her first month. She listened to the housekeeper's worries about the kitchen roof and the gardener's complaints about frost damaging the roses. She found comfort in small tasks, in useful work, in being needed by someone, even if that someone was not her husband. It was through these small tasks that she found Charlotte. Charlotte was Sebastian's niece, the daughter of his younger brother, who had died at sea along with his wife when the girl was only 4. Since then, Charlotte had lived at Blackthorn Manor, mostly forgotten by the household in its long season of mourning. She was 7 years old, quiet, and often alone in the nursery, with only a governess who came twice a week. Eleanor began visiting her in the afternoons. At first, Charlotte watched her with the same wary silence Eleanor had grown used to from Sebastian. But children are not as guarded as grown men, and within a few weeks, Charlotte was running to greet her at the nursery door, eager to show her a drawing or ask her to read aloud. Eleanor found herself looking forward to those afternoons more than any other part of her day. She did not tell Sebastian about these visits. She did not think he would care to know. At night, when the manor grew quiet and her thoughts grew loud, Eleanor began to write letters. She had no one to send them to. Her mother was far away and would only worry. Her few friends from before her marriage would not understand a life so strange as this one. So she wrote to no one in particular, simply putting down on paper what she could not say aloud. She wrote about her loneliness, plainly and without complaint, because complaining seemed pointless. She wrote about Charlotte's laugh and how it had surprised her the first time she heard it. She wrote about the strange, small moments when she thought she saw something soften in Sebastian's face, quickly hidden again before she could be certain. She wrote, more than once, that she was afraid of wanting to be loved by a man who had made it clear his heart belonged to someone else, someone who was no longer living, but who still ruled the house from her place above the fireplace. She could not bring herself to burn the letters, though she knew she should. Instead, she looked for a hiding place, somewhere private, somewhere she was certain no one would think to search. The answer came to her one afternoon, while dusting the great hall herself, since she refused to let a servant near what she privately called the Duke's shrine. She noticed that the frame of Margaret's portrait sat slightly away from the wall, and behind it was a narrow gap, hollow and hidden. It seemed almost fitting, she thought, to hide her secret feelings behind the portrait of the woman who had unknowingly caused them. One by one, she tucked her letters into that gap, tied together with a plain ribbon, and told herself she would remove them some day, when she no longer needed to write them at all. Months passed in this quiet, careful way. Eleanor grew close to Charlotte. She grew familiar with the running of the estate. She learned to live alongside her husband's silence, without letting it crush her, though it never stopped costing her something. But slowly, so slowly that she almost did not notice it happening, small changes appeared in Sebastian. He began attending dinner some evenings, instead of taking his meal in the study. At first he said little, but he was present, and presence was more than she had known from him before. Then he began asking small questions. How was her day? Had the roses recovered from the frost? Had she seen Charlotte's latest drawing, which the girl had proudly shown him herself, mentioning that Eleanor had helped her with the colors? Eleanor answered carefully, unwilling to hope too much, afraid that hope would only leave her more wounded than silence ever had. Still, she noticed him lingering near doorways he once avoided. She noticed him watching her sometimes across the dinner table, quickly looking away when she caught him. Sebastian, for his part, would not admit even to himself what was happening. He told his steward, and he told the empty air of his study, that his heart remained buried with Margaret, that duty alone kept this house running, that nothing had changed. But he found himself thinking of Eleanor at strange hours. He found himself comparing her patience with Charlotte to his own failures with the grieving child he had barely noticed for 2 years. He found himself, more than once, standing outside the nursery door, listening to Eleanor's voice reading a story, unwilling to interrupt and unable to walk away. The turning point came with a storm. It arrived suddenly in early autumn, tearing shingles from the roof of the west wing and cracking a support beam above the great hall. Workmen were called at once to reinforce the wall, and word came that the portrait would need to be removed to allow the repairs. Sebastian insisted on taking it down himself. He would not let strangers' hands touch something so precious to him, he said, though even as he said it, the words felt strangely heavy in his mouth, as though he were reciting a line from a play he no longer believed in. He lifted the portrait carefully from its hooks, and as he did, something slipped from behind the frame and fell to the floor with a soft sound. He set the painting aside and knelt down to see what it was. A bundle of letters, tied with a faded ribbon, lay on the stone floor. He recognized the handwriting at once. It was Eleanor's. He should have left them unread. He told himself this even as he carried them to his study, even as he sat down at his desk with the fire burning low, even as he untied the ribbon with hands that were not quite steady. He told himself this, and then he read every single one. He read of her loneliness, described so plainly that it struck him harder than any accusation could have. He read of her fear, that she would spend her whole life wanting to matter to a man who had already given his heart away. He read of her guilt, strange and unnecessary guilt, for wishing to be loved at all while living in a house so devoted to grief. He read of Charlotte, of small shared laughter, of drawings colored together on quiet afternoons he had known nothing about. He read of the moments she had noticed in him, moments he had not even realized he was showing her, small cracks in the wall he had built so carefully around himself. By the time he set the last letter down, the fire had burned low, and the candle beside him had melted into a shapeless stub. He sat for a long time in the dark, understanding at last what he had done. He had spent nearly a year mourning a portrait, a memory frozen in paint and silk, while a living woman had been trying, quietly and without demand, to love him from just beyond his study door. He did not sleep that night. At dawn, he found Eleanor in the small garden behind the kitchen, where she often walked before the household woke. She turned at the sound of his footsteps and saw the letters in his hand. Her face went pale. "You read them," she said quietly. "I did," he answered. "I am not sorry that I found them, though I am sorry it took me so long to see what was written between the lines, even before you put pen to paper." Eleanor said nothing, unwilling to trust the moment, unwilling to let herself hope only to be disappointed again. Sebastian continued, his voice unsteady in a way she had never heard from him before. He told her that Margaret's death had frozen something inside him, and that he had used her memory as a wall, a way to protect himself, from ever being hurt so deeply again. He admitted that the wall had done its work too well. It had not only kept out pain, it had kept out Eleanor as well, though she had been standing just on the other side of it the entire time, patient and steady, long after most people would have given up. He told her he had noticed her far earlier than he had ever let himself admit. Her patience with Charlotte, her refusal to be broken by his coldness, the strange, undeniable way the manor had begun to feel warmer simply because she was living in it. Eleanor, still cautious, asked him plainly what it was he wanted from her now. Sebastian did not answer with words alone. Later that same day, he had Margaret's portrait carefully moved to a private gallery in the East Wing, not out of disrespect for her memory, but as a quiet acknowledgement that grief could be honored without being allowed to rule every room of a living house. In its place above the great hall fireplace, he asked Eleanor if she would agree to sit for a new portrait, one that would include Charlotte as well, so that all three of them might finally be pictured together as the family they had slowly, unknowingly become. Eleanor agreed, though it took her many days to fully believe that the change in him was real and not simply a passing storm of guilt. As the weeks went on, she came to see that it was real. Sebastian began to spend his evenings with her instead of behind his study door. He learned Charlotte's favorite stories and began reading them aloud himself. He asked Eleanor's opinion on matters of the estate, and more importantly, he began to listen to her answers. Months later, while sitting at her writing desk, Eleanor found a letter tucked among her papers, one she had not written herself. It was in Sebastian's hand. In it, he confessed that he had fallen in love with her one small moment at a time, through her patience, her kindness to Charlotte, her quiet strength in the face of his coldness, though he had been too proud and too afraid to say so, until he held proof in his own hands of a devotion he had very nearly let slip away forever. That evening, the new portrait was finally hung above the fireplace in the great hall. It showed the three of them together, Sebastian, Eleanor, and Charlotte, standing close, without the distance that had once defined every room in that house. Eleanor stood beside her husband, looking up at the painted version of the family they had become, and felt, for the first time since arriving at Blackthorn Manor, that she was no longer standing in someone else's shadow. She was finally, fully seen.